Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being here today, and welcome to our Energy and Election Year event. I'm Jack Gerard, the President and CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, and wanted to welcome you here today. Now, we have a number of distinguished guests in our audience today, and at the risk of overlooking someone, I'm not going to introduce you individually. I will note Senator Bennett Johnson over here to the left, former chairman of the Senate Energy Committee. And one that will participate in our panel this afternoon is Senator Byron Dorgan, North Dakota, who's here. But we have a special announcement today. Yesterday, Byron turned 29. So we'd like to give him a round of applause for a job well done. And look forward to his comments as well as the other members of our distinguished panel who will be on following my remarks today. Now, today's event is one of many that the American Petroleum Institute will be holding throughout the year. Our design is to engage policymakers and voters in a conversation about our energy future. I'm sure this morning's panel will be of great interest to all of you, and I'm sure we'll get many insights from distinguished individuals who've been on the energy route or beat for many years now, particularly here in Washington. But a presidential election year is a good time for a comprehensive conversation about our policy direction and where we're going as a nation. And for just as the decision voters will make in November to determine the political outcome of the country, likewise the decision those leaders will make will determine the energy course of this nation for many years to come. The question facing America today is not whether we'll use more oil and natural gas. The question is where we will get it. We will use more of our own energy resources, but the question is, will we rely on others to get those energy resources? It is true that we will need energy of all types, more energy than we consume today. But let's be absolutely clear as we begin our conversation, and that is that according to the government's own projections, oil and natural gas will continue to supply most of the energy we use now and most of the energy we will use 3 to 4 decades from now. I believe we must acknowledge this energy reality and make the right choices for a bright energy future. A future with more jobs, with more economic growth, with more revenue to state, federal, local governments, but equally and most important, an issue that will be talked about by all running for public office is how do we create more energy security? How do we do this ourselves to supply the fuel our economy will demand? API has now launched a Vote for Energy campaign that I hope many of you have already seen to bring these choices into the wider public debate this year. We've already held events in Illinois and in Michigan. We've scheduled events in places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Missouri, and West Virginia, and elsewhere as the year goes on. We're trying to encourage a robust dialogue on our energy future, much like the one we'll have here today. A vote for energy is not a vote for a person, it's not a vote for a political party, and it's not a vote for a political philosophy. It is a vote for America and for our best and brightest future. With the right leadership and vision, we can take control of our energy future. We have the resources right here in our own nation. Including our shale resources, the United States has the most technically recoverable oil and natural gas in the world. We have more than Saudi Arabia, we have more than China, more than Brazil, more than Libya, Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq combined. That's how vast the resource is here in this country. Greater access to domestic resources is the cornerstone of our energy future and the first plank of our report to the platform committees, and all rests upon it. Developing our onshore and offshore resources, including Alaska, and strengthening our energy partnership with Canada could mean an additional 1.4 million American jobs by 2030. 1 million of those jobs could be created in the next 7 years. That's in addition to the 9.2 million American jobs the oil and natural gas industry supports today. That's good news for American workers, and it's good news for our government. pro-development energy policies could return over $803 billion in government revenue by 2030. Safely accessing more of our country's own resources, using our own workers to develop these resources, would mean more money from industry to government through royalties, leases, bonus bids, and corporate taxes. Right now, the oil and natural gas contribution to the federal treasury exceeds $86 million a day. Let me repeat that. We pay $86 million a day to the federal treasury. More access doesn't mean just more jobs, more economic growth, and more revenues for the treasury. It also means something every candidate will discuss this year, as I mentioned earlier. It means greater energy security. Energy geopolitics are rebalancing, and the Western Hemisphere, our nation, Canada, and Brazil combined, are at the forefront of this reshaping. Recently, there was an announcement made by a serious economist, a global economist, who indicated that over the next 10 years, if the policies are right, the United States can become the new Middle East for energy production. This is not a vision of America at the mercy of other oil-producing regions, or an America that's threatened by scarce resources, but of an America that holds the reins for its energy future and energy security along with our future prosperity. There are trillions of dollars worth of still to be developed oil and natural gas right here in the United States. Whether it's the latest in directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing or in deep water exploration, advances in technology are making every discovery potentially more productive while also improving our ability to conduct our operations more safely and responsibly, to protect our people while safely protecting the environment and producing this vast resource. But a common-sense regulatory structure is necessary to support and encourage this development, rather than one that imposes excessive and duplicative rules that provide no true added benefit. This is the second plank of our platform report. I think you've all been distributed a copy of our report today at your seat, a report that we will share with both Republican and Democrat platform committees as part of this vision we're talking about for our energy future. A former EPA's official's comments about crucifying oil and gas companies are a visible indication of a regulatory approach that is adversarial and perhaps hostile. We are calling for a transparent and open regulatory approach that invites input from the industry's best and brightest and bases rulemakings on sound science, legitimate cost-benefit analysis, and economic impact. This approach would help prevent the kind of regulatory blizzard the White House recently moved to manage as part of hydraulic fracturing, one where multiple rulemakings overlap and pile on top of each other, adding untold costs without any demonstrated benefit. EPA's Tier 3 fuels effort to further reduce sulfur emissions is but one example. The agency rolls forward without any justification and offered and without regard to its impact on the price of gasoline. We need an approach that keeps America's energy development from falling prey to regulatory snarl of overlapping and unnecessary rules while providing greater certainty to encourage the investment here on our shores. We need an approach that encourages business investment rather than discouraging it. With expanded access and regulatory approach that fosters domestic oil and natural gas production and refining, we could see energy investments here in the United States that boost our economic recovery and help us back on a path to prosperity. The oil and natural gas industry has been a bright spot in our troubled economy, accounting for 3% of all the jobs created since 2009, while spurring American manufacturing and revitalizing our local communities. Through a more efficient and timely permitting process, the third plank of our platform that you've received today, we can develop and refine domestic supplies of oil and gas to the highest standards, creating homegrown energy ready to work for America's businesses and for our families. Now this vision is threatened by those who want to restrain oil and natural gas development or keep these vital resources well beyond our reach. They favor only certain resources and particular investments. They applaud only some of our abundant energy supply. They obstruct and delay oil and natural gas investments with a strategy of erecting legal hurdles and by calling for increased taxes on oil and natural gas companies. While some like to bash big oil actually is the big taxpayer. 3 of our companies top Forbes' recent list of companies that paid the most income taxes in 2011. 3 of our companies top that list. We pay our fair share. We not only pay our fair share, if you look at the numbers, we pay more than our fair share. In fact, oil and natural gas companies pay taxes at a considerably higher rate than the other Standard & Poor's industrial companies. Just over 40% to oil and gas compared to 25% for the other industrial average. Meanwhile, since 2000, our industry has invested nearly $2.4 trillion in U.S. capital projects. That's a T, $2.4 trillion in U.S. capital projects since 2000 to meet the growing demand for our vast energy needs. Because the industry must plan, invest, and operate over very long lead times, it is crucial for managing financial risk that government regulatory policies and tax framework encourage investment and provide certainty for business planning. The 4th plank and the last plank I'll mention today of our platform calls for a market-based approach to energy and to end government picking winners and losers through calls for punitive tax hikes. Higher taxes could make some energy investments too costly to pursue, put upward pressure on energy prices, and undermine the savings and retirement plans of millions of Americans who are the true owners of big oil. Millions of Americans hold 97% of the corporate shares of the oil and natural gas industry through public and private pension and retirement funds such as 401ks, IRAs, individual investments, and financial institutions. A political and policy commitment to developing our vast domestic oil and natural gas resources will provide not just the energy security we've talked about, but financial security for millions of Americans who are the true owners of oil and natural gas. Polls show most Americans think we're on the wrong track when it comes to energy policy. To get on the right track, we must get serious about our energy future. That's why API is working hard to inform voters on important energy matters and encouraging them to make energy a ballot box issue in 2012. Through our Vote for Energy campaign, we believe we have outlined a vision for our energy future, where people and the economy benefit with hundreds of thousands of new jobs created, increased investment right here on our own soil, and billions in new revenues for government while bolstering our national security. We must abandon the policies driven by zero-sum game for the energy equation, a philosophy that says we must have less of oil and gas so that we can have more of something else yet to be defined in a responsible way. We must resist those who pit one resource against another. The EIA predicts we'll need 16% more energy of all forms to meet our projected energy demands by 2035. We have the resources to meet our energy challenges, and with the right leadership and the right vision, we can turn these present-day challenges into clear future opportunities that will make our country and economy stronger for generations yet to come. I look forward to working with all of you, with our platform committees of both the Democratic and Republican parties, to make this vision a reality. Thank you for being here today. We greatly appreciate your involvement and hope we can work together to achieve what's in the best interest of our nation with our vast energy resource. Thank you very much. Now let me turn to our august energy panel today, the experts I mentioned earlier. And I'd like to first introduce our moderator to moderate energy policy and politics in an election year. Steve Power, who many of you know, has a wealth of experience, former serving as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal for many years, knows a great deal about the politics and policy surrounding energy. He's a past winner of the National Press Club's Sandy Hume Memorial Award for Excellence in Political Journalism and is currently a director at the Brunswick Group here in Washington. So please join me in welcoming Steve to introduce our panel. Steve?
Thanks, Jack. Just a reminder, if you're tweeting today's event, the hashtag, it's hashtag Energy2012. So I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves, but as Jack was saying, I'm Steve Power. I'm a director in the Washington office of the Brunswick Group, which is a London-based global strategic communications consultancy. With that, I'd like to welcome our panelists up to the stage. So, Joe, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Joe Stank. I'm a partner at the law firm of Hutton & Williams. I have an energy and environmental practice that centers on Clean Air Act, some Clean Water Act, climate, and other issues. I spent 6 years as counsel to the House Energy and Commerce Committee on Energy and Clean Air Act issues, and before that was a practicing environmental attorney in Washington, D.C. for a number of years.
Senator Dorgan?
I'm a recovering politician, having served 30 years in the United States Congress, most recently in the Senate, and chaired the Energy and Water Appropriations Panel, which Senator Bennett at one point chaired as well. I'm now just published a book a few weeks ago called Blowout, available on Amazon, downloaded to Kindle, and I'm teaching at Georgetown and at Arent Fox, and doing a lot of other things as well, but enjoying myself, and I'm pleased to be here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Connaughton. I'm a recovering policymaker. I'm now at Exelon Corporation, the biggest, cleanest, most competitive power company in America. And before that, I served for 8 years as the chairman of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, heavily involved in all matters energy, natural resources, and environment.
Good morning. My name is Kevin Book, and I guess my job has been analyzing them for a little over a decade now. I am managing director of Clearview Energy Partners, which is a research firm serving financial investors and corporate strategists. We look at macro events that could move supply, demand, or price. And if you start anywhere, wellhead, burner tip, spreadsheet, eventually you end up with the government as the biggest macro factor. So we look a lot at policy.
Thanks, Kevin. So I want to start with a question for Senator Dorgan, since you're fresh out of politics. Obviously, voters' perceptions of the economy are widely believed to be the most influential factor in this year's elections. But obviously, energy prices and energy policy can influence the economy. So I'm just wondering, what role do you see energy issues, energy prices, energy policy playing in this election?
Well, I think it'll play some role, but a lot depends always on the price of gasoline. There's nothing that quite galvanizes the American mind like a $4 or $4.50 or $5 a gallon gasoline projected. And I do think also it's probably going to play less a role than some think. I'm talking about energy now, because the political system has great difficulty assimilating good news. This is an unbelievable good news story. It's almost the black swan theory of the impact of the highly improbable. No one in this room 7 or 10 years ago would have predicted what has happened today. We didn't know. We couldn't even see it on the frequency charts of what might be possible. So this is awfully good news in a lot of areas on energy. And again, you know, the old saying, bad news travels halfway around the world before good news gets its shoes on. Well, this is really good news, and largely it is the negatives that drive the political system. So it may play less of a role than one would think, but it's very important for the American people to understand where we are in energy, what this contributes to our both energy security and our national security.
Jim, what do you think? How are energy issues going to play in this election?
Well, I'll make the top line comment, which is I'm actually amazed that at least so far, this is the first election in a long time where energy is in the top 5 list. Now, not surprisingly, because of its immediate connection to jobs and economic growth. And so, in the past, when jobs and economic growth weren't at the forefront, maybe we weren't thinking about energy so much. But I really am amazed. In both the Obama campaign and the Romney campaign, they're spending a lot of time talking about energy and visions of energy. I do share Senator Dorgan's view that there's incredible, it's just immensely a good news story. God bless America. Just when we're up against the wall, we have this incredibly inexpensive new resource that's leading to technology advancement that's allowing this just remarkable new capacity to also develop oil and other very high-value liquids and products that come from that America's really good at, and also that really good high-quality jobs come from it. And so, getting our head around that and not screwing it up, I think, becomes a centerpiece of how we go forward. And on the not screw it up factor, I just want to make one observation. A story of the shale boom, an important one, is it's booming because it's largely on private land or on state land, not because it's on federal land. And so we have just a stark picture that we've been lacking for some time to show you just how fast the private sector and state-based activities can move when they are not constrained from moving. And I think the federal government's had a hard time catching up with that. There's now rethinking of what the federal government do to play its part with our public lands that are actually dedicated to these purposes. But I think this election's about that juxtaposition of government needing to move at the speed of business, as government does its important job of protecting health and safety and environmental and natural resources. But how can government move at that speed so we don't disadvantage ourselves in the global marketplace?
Joe Stanko, you follow what's going on at the EPA and other regulatory agencies. How are events on the campaign trail affecting the speed and substance of what agencies like the EPA are up to?
Well, I think there's a lot of reaction on the campaign trail to recent regulations and the discussion of ongoing regulations at EPA. And I think as a top-line concern, a number of policymakers are looking at and seeing certain actions that are taking us a little bit backwards on energy diversity and backwards on production. With regard to some of the recent regulations on coal-fired power plants, I think we're seeing new plants, coal-fired power plants being, for all effective purposes, taken off of the table, and there's some reaction to that. I think the regulations on the Utility MACT and the new source performance standards for greenhouse gases are going to result in even more coal plant retirements, and that's going to have an effect on the generating community. Coal's a large part of our current generation fleet. That capacity is not immediately going to be taken up, and the current economic situation, I think, is masking a generation shortage in the U.S., and if we hit a recovery, I think consumers and industry will see that. On the natural gas and the oil shale play side of the house, I agree with what Jim said about a fantastic amount of movement going on private land. I think policymakers are looking, and this will be part of the discussion, that number one, how are we going to get appropriate access to federal lands, and number two, hydraulic fracturing, while largely regulated at the state level, appears to be on the path to some kind of regulation at the federal level. A lot of people have concerns about how that is going to impact the speed and the ability to bring this resource online.
And do you see any sign that the rhetoric on the campaign trail is having any impact on what agencies like the EPA are doing, the substance, the speed, and not just the EPA,
right.
DOE, Interior?
Right. Well, the thing about EPA is I think they've taken a lot of their big ticket rules and marched them out the window, certainly with regard to power plants, and I don't know that there are big ticket rules that are going to be going final between now and the election. One of the miraculous things about election years is At some point, for some reason, big ticket rules don't seem to appear after July or August in a campaign year. But I think folks are going to be certainly talking about the past rules, and also we've got some rules like the new PM 2.5 standards that are scheduled in August. Be interesting to see if those actually roll out and whether EPA would go final before the election on things like the new source performance standard for greenhouse gases.
Kevin Book, you published a report not long ago in which you talked about how hydrocarbon production matters in some swing states, but only a few, and how voters in the swing states are concerned about high gasoline prices, but perhaps not overly so. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your research found.
Sure. Thanks for the question. The problem with the energy production we've had in the United States to date, and especially currently, is that it's very efficient. About 80% of the GDP thrown off by oil and gas, which is 1% of national GDP as a total, which, by the way, if 1% of your GDP is creating 3% of your new jobs, that's pretty good. That's in 4 states. So a lot of people don't see this. They don't understand. They're not infatuated with the changes or the gains. And so in many of these states that have never historically been, or at least in 110 years, like Pennsylvania, oil-producing states of note, there's suddenly big changes afoot. And in Pennsylvania and Ohio, they matter. But in the other 11 states identified as swing states, most of them are net energy consumers without much leverage or production. They don't really care. And actually, their energy costs have been remarkably close to the national average. Now, the national average is a big deal. Household share of wallet going to energy has gone up by about 2.33% over the last decade. That's a big deal. And people do care about energy in this election because of not just the economic opportunity it provides, but the cost implications of what's going to happen. And that maybe takes us to sort of maybe one of the challenges for U.S. energy policy, which is it tends to be very reactive. We have a tendency to think that the present state of affairs is the way it's always going to be. Demand is at a low point, really a dramatic low point, and some of that is compression because people are facing these household costs. Some of that, though, is going to change and come back with economic recovery. We all want that, and we better make sure that we're making the right investments now, countercyclically, because nothing costs more than closing the supply-demand gap in a hurry.
Senator Dorgan, let's look ahead to potentially a second Obama term. What do you think that means for energy policy? What lessons do you think the president and his aides have learned from the past few years about energy, from both their successes and their setbacks?
Well, I think if President Obama gains his second term, I do think the energy policy will be a balanced policy. I think you'll see more activity to open federal areas for drilling. Let me just point out, however, that it's not as if there's been a massive closing of those areas. We're actually producing more now on federal lands than we did the last 3 years of the previous administration. But it is true that the private sector has just galloped along. And I come from a state, North Dakota, where we now have, I think, 206 drilling rigs, drilling 1 well a month. That's 2,400 wells a year. It is an unbelievable success story in North Dakota. We very soon will be the second largest oil producer in America. And let me just, if I have the time to tell you one short story, to tell you what a great success this has been. There was a researcher in England studying the night photographs from the space station 240 miles above the Earth. And when you study the planet at night, you see from the lights where the population centers are, and he found a mystery city. He saw Minneapolis, St. Paul, Sioux Falls, Fargo, Bismarck, and then he saw a mystery city on the western plains of North Dakota. And it was the flaring of natural gas from what I think is becoming the largest oil field in the world. Obviously, they're finding a lot of oil, the best quality oil, and they're at this point still flaring much of the natural gas to create a mystery city for an English researcher. Having said all that, this is a good news story. I think this administration understands that. I understand that a number of things have happened, the BP issue in the Gulf. I offered the amendment that would have opened up the Eastern Gulf that passed the Energy Committee on a bipartisan vote, but the BP situation changed all of that. But I think we will move along, opening in the right way public lands, federal lands, and I think we're set to have a very robust and encouraging energy future, which not only includes oil and natural gas, but includes other fuels and renewable energy as well.
Mr. Condon, how do you see a Romney administration confronting energy issues, and particularly on the issue of climate change? What would a Romney administration, what kind of policies would it support on that issue?
Well, you've got, go to the campaign site, take a look at their information. I think Governor Romney has been very focused on what everyone says, which is we're for an all of the above strategy. But I think the campaigns worked very hard to identify those areas and those bottlenecks that they would go after to be sure that we have all of the pieces of the energy equation moving. And that ranges everywhere from clean coal to even rethinking the nuclear energy equation, which is also, I think, important from a diversity perspective and from an energy security perspective. I would observe that it's time to action that's the big issue. So when we talk about a lot more federal public land development in the last 3 years, it's because of the 5 years of work it took before that to make that development possible. And that's a long time before you get the green light to go forward with something that's economically productive, a job creator, and by the way, that complies with all environment and natural resource laws. One of the myths of all of this development is that somehow it's some new area that we now have to look at regulation. Well, as it happens, every project, including the Keystone Pipeline, has to comply 100% with all of our environmental and natural resource laws at the federal, state, and local level. So there's not some magic new environmental issue here. There's a whole suite of regulations that actually these companies spend a lot of money and are actually pretty good at complying with. And so to me, what I think you'll see out of a Romney approach is a much more business-oriented, how do we get the job done in the quickest period of time while hitting all of our performance marks in terms of getting jobs moving, in terms of getting the energy supply going, in terms of more rational approaches to public lands management, and assuring that these projects continue to meet environmental requirements 100% of the time.
Great. So whoever wins in November is going to have to confront the deficit. That's going to be one of the biggest issues for whoever is the next president. And I'm curious how you all see energy policy being influenced by the imperatives of deficit reduction. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on how that is going to constrain policymakers, what areas it's going to lead them into?
Well, one sure prescription for zero-sum politics is to start pointing to big numbers and making big statements. And part of the problem is that you have about $1.2 trillion out of our budget in tax expenditures, of which about $200 billion are business, and of that, depending on how you count, between 40 and 80 billion can be linked to energy. So it's a big target, and within that there are some big targets. But if you were to look at those targets in terms of how much energy you get per tax expenditure dollar, you'd find that some of the most maligned sources are actually some of the most productive from a tax and tax policy perspective. I'm not sure that's how the debate's going to look. That hasn't historically been how the debate looks, but deficit reduction means cutting something, and the high flyers and the big numbers are probably the first targets.
And on that point, Senator Dorgan, I'm curious what your perspective is on this, because, I mean, in one sense, you can see how the imperatives of deficit reduction could lead to higher taxes on certain industries, including this one. It could also potentially lead policymakers to open up more acreage so they can generate more royalties. How do you see deficit reduction playing out and energy policy making being influenced?
Well, I think everything in the budget is at some risk because these deficits are very substantial. But I do think when we talk about the good news from an energy policy standpoint, this is also something that is made in America, and what has pulled off the charts for the last 5 years is anybody talking about made in America. This energy is made in America, and I think we'd be pretty unwise to decide that we shouldn't provide assistance and subsidies and incentives in the right way. At the end of this year, the production tax credit for wind, for example, falls off a cliff. It's very important, in my judgment, for us to continue that. And I mean, I really think that we should, I'm for all of the above. We should do everything and do it well, and we should be very careful and thoughtful about what kinds of incentives do we want going forward. But everything in the budget is going to be at risk, and I suspect especially not just at the end of this year, but also next year when there is tax reform on the table, which will be a very substantial effort as well.
Yeah, but just one comment. One of the interesting things about energy is, as opposed to something like healthcare, where you've got a lot of federal capital moving into it, one of the easiest ways to stimulate capital development in the energy area is to have responsible but consistent policies going forward. I mean, in the electricity sector, we're seeing a lot of capital sitting on the sideline because of the uncertainty about how coal-fired power plants are going to be regulated, or how coal as a resource or other resources are going to be using. And I think one way, without having it, scored anything with regard to Congress, is for some of these regulatory actions to be done on a little bit better science, analyzing some of these long-term impacts, working with a compliance program that allows folks to meet the environmental standards, yet pull in capital, private capital.
Talk about,
Can I just mention to you that I chair, along with Trent Lott, Senator Lott, a project over at the Bipartisan Policy Center working on energy issues. And we have, especially this issue, taking a look at all the incentives that exist. This should not be a case of, ready, fire, aim. Let's really understand what exists out there, how it's being used, to what effect. And so we have a project ongoing. It's a 2-year project. Will be completed in January or February of next year to give to the next president and the next Congress.
Yeah, so let me pick up on that, and let me give 2 points. Let me talk about the tax incentives and that whole setting. Also, for the first time in 25 years, right, or almost 25 years, we're going to have a big debate on comprehensive tax reform. And that creates a very interesting platform post-election, not in the lame duck, to see in the industrial part of America what the appropriate capital formation balance will be between corporate tax rate reduction, and there may be a willingness to forego some of these. Some are direct subsidies, some are tax credits, some are, as Jack was talking about, some are just the regular taxation system applicable to all, which the Bipartisan Center is looking at. But there's a very interesting potential for a new way of thinking about these capital structures that, in my view, will be important in 2 respects. One is when you're subsidizing every source of energy, to the extent there's being subsidized equally, you're not subsidizing anything, right? It's just you're asking the taxpayer to just bring money back in to change the pricing of the entire system. Now, as it turns out, above that line, there's different preferences, but it's a much smaller wedge of the amount of money that's coming out of the federal fisc. And so I think we're going to have the first opportunity to have a real conversation about that, and then figure out maybe there's a pretty big horse trade. For our part, just to give one example, and we're in the entire energy space, including upstream gas, we've begun to seriously question all of the subsidy structures, because we are experiencing just some absurd distortions. We are big in wind, we're big in nuclear, we've got lots of gas, we have coal, but there's some just really absurd distortions that are now happening because we haven't thought through all the consequences of this. And so I think this is a rare moment. But the other side of the equation is the industrial demand side of the equation. If we can get more rational market view, transparent market view on these different energy sources, and if we have a bit of a rational sense to tell the private sector, this is what your rule set's going to look like for the next 5 to 10 years, then you can see an even more explosive growth in industrial capital investment and demand and jobs and investment in environmental protection. Right now, there's a phrase, money is the coward. And a lot of capital planning is just stuck. Because until you know what the rule is, it's hard to make a commitment because you don't know what your rate of return is going to be. And we're an incredibly competitive nation, and our rate of returns are small. They're not huge like in IT. When you're in the industrial space and the energy space, they're really, really tight margins that you're getting. And that difference of just not knowing where that regulatory arbitrage is the difference between spending money on a new project or not. And because of the uncertainty of this whole set of rules and what they'll require, it's this invisible drag on the economy that nobody talks about very much, but it's invisible and it's big. It's big, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of investment just waiting to kind of know what's coming. And I think that's the greatest challenge for the new president, whether it's Barack Obama or Mitt Romney.
So what would your company be willing to give up in exchange for regulatory certainty? I mean, you're saying you're looking at subsidies that perhaps should be on the table. Your company at one point sought a loan guarantee from the Department of Energy. would your company or your industry be willing to support, giving up those as part of a grand deal that would give you regulatory certainty in terms of time it takes to build a new reactor, or?
Yeah, and so for us, as we look at the equation, it's you have the corporate tax rate reform, you have the very important issue of expensing and dividends, which actually keep capital costs low and help people with retirement and pensions. And so there's going to be a lot of weight toward let's look at that side of the ledger. And then when the pressure comes to say what's on the other side of the ledger, we're going to be very constructive in that conversation. You mentioned loan guarantees for nuclear. That is one of those very focused programs that provides in a competitive electricity market the equivalent of rate-based recovery in a monopoly regulatory environment. And so if you're trying to create a backstop for nuclear, you have to look at that. But again, even that is not working very well, is our experience. It didn't work well in the case of us trying to build a 4,000 union job nuclear power plant. And so it's time to rethink some of this.
So maybe giving those up? Or?
Our view is we like the free market. We like a level playing field, and simplify is probably the best thing we could possibly do at this point, and bring durable certainty is the second best thing we can do at this point. So we're going to be very constructively engaged in that conversation.
Okay, great. There's been a lot of talk about the EPA and the impact, obviously, that it has on the energy industry. I think I saw somewhere the other day that Lisa Jackson was quoted as, the administrator of the EPA was quoted as saying that, the current, no credible economist attributes the current economic situation to clean air or clean water. Joe, what do you say to that?
Well, I don't know, and I'm not an economist. Maybe Kevin can help me bail out on this one. But I do think that if you look at folks who have the responsibility to kind of poll their members, the National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber, various groups, they will say that the regulatory environment in the U.S. is a factor. And as someone who was formerly involved in policy and is still watching from the sidelines, one of the concerns that I have is we're creating a regulatory environment both on the energy side and elsewhere that is making it just not as attractive to put manufacturing in the U.S. I think by and large, if it's not here, it's going to go to places that have
What's a
stringent
specific example that you?
Well, I think you look at some of the chemical industry, some of the manufacturing industry. I know a lot of our domestic fertilizer production has gone offshore because of energy prices and input prices. But here's, one example. Let's put tax policy or whatever aside. If you look at how EPA approached the new source performance standards for greenhouse gases, somebody building a new power plant has to hit all the bogeys on the emission of conventional pollutants. What EPA did, it says we want carbon capture and sequestration on new coal-fired power plants, essentially. It's a technology that, while promising, is not in any kind of commercially effective application right now. And so the Faustian bargain that's in this regulation is you can build a brand new coal-fired power plant now, but in 10 years, you'll have to have carbon capture and sequestration up and running, or we'll turn the switch off. Now, you go to Wall Street and try and get funding for a plant that costs hundreds of millions of dollars, if not close to $1 billion for some of these, on this kind of bet the come. And I don't think that is a productive way to attract capital into the energy sector.
Let me just make the point, however, that $2 or $2.50 per MCF natural gas means that if you are a utility executive planning to build a new plant and choosing a fuel source, you're just not likely to choose coal at the moment. Although, the other question, the shadow that lingers and will continue to linger for some long while is, will there be, and if so, when, will there be a price on carbon? If so, when, and what will the price be? Now, I had all kinds of utility executives come into my office and say, you know what, somehow, some way, Congress has to make a decision so we have some certainty going forward. Without that certainty, we sit there, we don't have the foggiest idea what's going to happen to us 5 and 10 years from now in terms of the price of coal, for example. So I think that shadow will continue to exist until some way this political system makes a judgment about it. In the meantime, there seems to be this notion in America that despite the fact in 2007, 5 short years ago, FERC was warning about a shortage of natural gas in our country. FERC was very concerned about that and talking about the import of natural gas. Despite that, we now have an abundance of natural gas being projected, and some people believe that it'll always be $2 an MCF, which is, of course, not the case at all. None of us have the foggiest idea what this price is going to be, because there are other markets around the world that are now paying $10 and $12 and more per MCF for natural gas. And so all of those uncertainties exist, and some of them can be handled and hopefully will be handled by the Congress, some by regulatory authorities, some perhaps by the private sector, but those uncertainties cause great angst about what kind of investments you make in the future. Fortunately, that is not the case in the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota. They're drilling 200 wells a month, 2,400 wells a year, and this is not looking for a pool of oil. They never miss. They don't drill dry holes because they know exactly where the shale formation is and where it ends. And so when they put up a drilling rig and go down 10,000 feet and then go out 2 miles after they find the middle third of a 100-foot seam, it is the most sophisticated, unbelievable advance in oil drilling in our lifetime.
And yet the irony is they're flaring because now they have all this surplus gas that they can't get to market.
They're flaring natural gas because to capture it costs more than they want to pay for $2 an MCF market price gas. And it's also the case that they're very busy pulling up oil from these wells that is very valuable. Right. And so, this is, as I said when I started, this is a good news story. And I think will continue for some while. And by the way, I was told, I have not found this source, but I was told that 1/2 of the drilling rigs for natural gas and oil in the world exist now in the United States, to show you the unbelievable activity that exists in our country.
So I think I can connect the dots a little bit on Joe's point and maybe bring all of this together a little bit. First of all, my clients, the financial institutional investors, are not paid to lose other people's money. They're paid at best to keep it there and generally try to deliver returns. So they are very cautious about subsidizing uncertainty, and regulatory risk for them is at least as painful as it is for the companies in which they invest. Second, the question about sort of the greenhouse gas price may be answered April 30th of next year because it could fly across an airplane from Europe. We're at the beginning of a trade challenge with our close partner across the Atlantic over aviation emissions of greenhouse gases, and the next administration will have to tackle it. What they do and how could actually start to bring a price into the equation. Third, the overall question of whether you're going to have $2 gas or not. I think anyone whose business is built on the idea that gas will be $2 probably needs sleeping pills at night, particularly if they've looked at history. On the other hand, if you look at our industries here, one of the fundamental reasons why the European Union's trade policies matter to us is because trade is the economic upside to energy here. We have succeeded in becoming more efficient, diversified, and we have been blessed with this abundance that Senator Dorgan spoke of. We know where the resource is. The finding and development costs are very low. Producing more of it is easy, which means that export markets are the economic upside in many ways. And to this, Joe, is the connecting line. If you have environmental regulations that make it tough to service burgeoning, racing global demand, then you have limitations on the extent to which American jobs and American dollars can deliver dividends to American stockholders and American companies. And so, I mean, we will feel that more poignantly as we continue to become more efficient and face greater and greater competition with other producers with their own environmental rules that may be much looser in other countries.
So just to pick up on that, Michael Levy with the Council on Foreign Relations, who writes often about energy issues, he wrote an article last week saying that the euphoria over oil and natural gas is out of control, or is overly abundant. And what he argued is that even if the United States were to meet all of its demand needs by producing its own oil and natural gas, we would still be exposed to price volatility because oil is a globally traded commodity. And I was just wondering, to what extent, perhaps, Senator Dorgan, you've thought a lot about the issue of the role of financial markets in influencing the price of oil. I mean, is it possible that perhaps some of the rhetoric about this boom in energy production is a little bit overheated?
Well, I don't think the excitement about it is overheated at all. We ought to be excited about something that provides this much benefit to our country and our economy, both in energy security and national security. But it is the case that even if we obliterated the need for oil imports into this country, and we produced sufficient for our own economy and our energy needs, it is the case that energy is priced internationally. And we see that today. Our economy slows down. So we have an economy that had contracted some and is still a slower economy. We have improved efficiency in automobiles very substantially, so we're using less for that purpose, and that's where a substantial amount of oil is used. And even as that has happened, we are dramatically increasing the production of oil in the last several years. You've not seen the impact of that in the marketplace here in this country. Why? Because this is not where oil is priced. It's priced internationally, and a substantial amount of it internationally, as you know, is owned by sovereigns. And so the short answer is yes, it's priced internationally, and even if we produce all of our own oil, we will still be watching what happens to the price of oil that has to do with other parts of the world.
Yeah, but I also have a simple way of looking at this, though, which is, yes, the international price is going to dramatically, will influence and will be the lead point on whatever the domestic price of oil is right now. But if we're making more of it here with American, situated companies employing Americans, and those profits are staying in American settings and paying their taxes, then if the price is going up and all that activity is at that end of the ledger, well, more of it is staying here. Conversely, if there's a collapse in the global price, because we brought on so much and the marginal price, all of a sudden the structure has changed in ways that even Kevin couldn't predict, then we'll also be the beneficiaries of that on the other end of the equation. And so the idea is not that somehow we should or must be an island with respect to our own production. It's that we are enjoying more of a share of our own use of this resource made here. And I think that's, the debate is on either end of that point, but that's really the core point. It's almost like it's like a national hedge. We just get more of the upside and more of the upside on either end of the ledger.
Yeah, except I think you asked the question because in the political campaigns out there, we had people saying if we just drill a few more wells, we'll get $2.50 gas, which of course is absurd. There's no relationship.
Joe, were you going to chime in on that? No. So how do you see these issues playing out with respect to the Keystone Pipeline? We've talked a lot about how energy issues might influence the election, but in some cases, isn't it possible that the election could influence policy? I'm thinking particularly on Keystone. Senator Dorgan, do you have any thoughts on how that issue could be influenced by the election?
Well, in my judgment, the Keystone Pipeline is going to be built. The question is when's the decision made, but in my judgment, this is a pipeline that will be built. As you know, there's a portion of it now in the congested area in Oklahoma to the Gulf that is going to move forward. But I think the Keystone will be built. I assume it's going to be debated substantially on the campaign trail. At the end of the day, this country will have a Keystone Pipeline.
You think the administration will support it like this year, or what? And what makes you think that?
Well, nothing makes me think anything. I just think it.
Yeah. Perhaps I should have said leads you to think that. What facts or inferences lead you in that direction?
Well, this happens to be a fact-free zone for me. I just happen to think that a couple things. Well, seriously, a couple things happen. Number one, the Republicans put a piece in a bill that had nothing to do with energy that suggested the administration had to act at a time when they could not possibly act, given what Nebraska had to do and some environmental studies that should be done. So they knew they were setting it up. The president vetoed the bill. Everybody knew what the game was back and forth politically. I think we also understand the president is reluctant to move forward because he has some supporters that are concerned about it. He's trying to make a decision. I think he's going to make a decision later rather than sooner. You can judge what I mean by that, but I do think that Keystone ultimately is going to be built. It's just my judgment.
Yeah. So what I find puzzling about Keystone, though, and emblematic, because I don't have the same confidence, but I don't think it, I don't know the other side of the equation. I wouldn't say it's not going to be built. What I find puzzling is at the end of the day, Keystone came down to Nebraska being uncomfortable with the route and the ground level and wanting to look at something different. There's the whole issue about whether oil sands should ever find their way, oil sands production, the oil from that should ever find its way into America. But that's not what's at issue at Keystone on the legal requirements. And so what's puzzling to me is the 3 years of NEPA work that have been done. Right? Remember, the pipeline has to comply with all environmental laws. And there's the environmental review. So it's not one or the other. And there's the environmental review. Well, the 3 years of work have been done. Modest additional input was needed to figure out what an alternative route, what its effects would be, and ways to mitigate further issues. And it would seem to me to have been a moment to say, let me work with the Congress to be sure that this thing then isn't litigated for the next 5 years. Because that's what always happens with a major infrastructure deal with the environmental review process. And so what Congress was actually offering was to say, the work you've done is good, it's sufficient, it's adequate, we don't need to go to court on it. That's really the way I read the legislation. Now, I think I would have written it differently, but that's really what the legislation is about. If you there's the politics swarming it, but it would seem to me it's still the case that even if Senator Dorgan's view came through and the thing was approved by this administration or by a new administration, you still have hanging out there this issue of the long tail of litigation that comes with a big project like this, with key constituencies just wanting to block it at any cost. And so this is a perfect time for Congress, right, to think of a new construct that assures that the laws are met, that assures that the review is done, but takes off the long tail and the uncertainty of litigation, where you're otherwise meeting environmental standards. And that's what I'm naive in that sense, or maybe I'm a Pollyanna. The objective appears to be the same, and yet the solution set, which is a legislative one, is being held at bay. Puzzling.
Without wearing out this subject, so you just cannot say on Keystone, politics aside. You just can't say that. Absolutely. Because there is a barrel full of politics on both sides of this, and ultimately, as I indicated, I think.
Yeah, but Byron, we should say politics aside on this kind of thing.
You're
supposed to have deliberate, predictable rules for how you get through a process like this, and then it should be of reasonable duration so you can get a yes or no, and either your capital goes to the project because it's got a yes, or it goes someplace else where you have a higher certainty. But this waiting and waiting and waiting that ties up the speed with which we can achieve some of these results.
I understand, but that legislation was an immaculate conception no one had seen. So, it was exactly the wrong way to do things. There's a barrel full of politics on all sides of this. At the end of the day, I think it gets built.
Yeah. Before we,
I guess my only question is, when?
Yeah.
Because the litigation will go on, and the courts invariably send you back for more review, and there's a question at a certain point, having done the work, is that really what we're about in trying to get some of these big infrastructure projects going? And I know you've actually been a constructive voice on the policy side of this, but when is the big issue?
Before we go to questions, I just am curious for you, Jim, and also Senator Dorgan, since you have relatively recently made the transition from government to the private sector, I'm just curious how that transition, to what extent it's affected your outlook on energy issues. Are there any issues that you've changed your mind on since leaving government service, or perhaps has leaving government service and going to the private sector reinforced your views in a strong way on any particular energy topics?
Well, I remain a believer that we need a thoughtful energy policy in this country that doesn't yet exist. I'm a big fan of the free market. I don't think there's a better allocator of goods and services that I know of than the free market system. But I also think that our country has to have some aspirations about where it wants to find itself. There's this old saying, if you don't care where you're going, you're never going to be lost. Well, that's true for our country and energy policy as well. You just sort of let happen what happens. I'm not for picking winners and losers, but I am for picking winners. And I do think that our country ought to have a vision of where does it want to be? How does it want to get there? What does it want to do to get there in energy policy? I regret very much that the 2009 bill that we wrote in the Energy Committee in the Senate, that I helped write the transmission piece, the opening up the Eastern Gulf, the first ever renewable electricity standard, clean renewable energy development bonds, and so on. I regret very much that we lost that and didn't get it to the floor of the Senate. But something like that, in my judgment, I said then, believed then, and still believe now, something like that would advantage our country and be, I think, be helpful to our country going forward with respect to energy policy.
I guess my view is, picking off of that, we have tons of energy policy, including in 2 bills in 2005, bipartisan, and then the bill in 2007, bipartisan. George Bush and Nancy Pelosi, for heaven's sakes, coming together with big programs, and Senator Dorgan was a key steward of that activity. And then I share the view that we now have this package pending in the Senate that was actually very thoughtful, and had it been allowed to advance, the appropriate changes and corrections and adjustments would have been made to accommodate even greater perspectives and bring on board the House. And so I think that was a real moment lost. And so you can decide may have your own decision about what was the reason for that and the leadership questions associated with that. But it's still there. That package exists. It's got lots of support. And there's some new items that have come on board. Where I get a little bit cautious from the private sector perspective, especially, but I had it when I was in the government, is the market's going to take us to the cheapest compliant resource. All right? And so you need the government standards on health, safety, environment, and all of that. And the market will get us there a lot faster in ways that we can't imagine. And so what I now know even more is simplify. The government should back out. The government should be the cop on the beat, not the manager, the coach, and the player. If we could rethink our energy policy to get a clear definition of the boundaries of where government needs to play a role in defining the commons, and then back out of much of the rest, I think we can accomplish a great deal faster. I know this now even more in private sector experience, even on the environmental side. Where is efficiency happening faster? Where is air pollution reduction happening faster? Where are capital investments going quicker? It's in the competitive markets in America, not in the old traditional regulated monopoly markets. That's a question that's very politically sensitive to ask and debate. And yet we now have empirical experiencing demonstrating the value of the different models. So I think that's where I think the energy policy should go. It requires real leadership by the Congress to take on some of these old saws, and say, is it time to modernize the way we think about this? And that's a challenge for a new President Obama on a re-elect, a new President Romney, and it's as big, if not a greater challenge for the U.S. Congress. And they've shied away from those big structural questions for a long time.
Great, thank you. So I think we're going to go to questions and answers now, and I think Jack Gerard's going to join us to take some of them.
The easy ones, Steve.
Okay. Okay.
Important.
Okay.
The important ones, the bottom line ones.
So, Mr. Gerard, I was wondering if you could comment on the White House's latest comments on idle oil and gas leases. This is the assertion that the oil and gas industry has let a lot of leased public lands go developed.
Well, I haven't seen exactly what they're going to say, but I understand today they will make an announcement suggesting that the industry is sitting on vast leases on the public lands and failing to produce them. And our response to that is that statement is oversimplified and it's misleading. And what I mean by that is if you look at their characterization of idle leases, normally they include in that leases where we're trying to get permits, we're trying to get permission to develop this land. For example, there was a permit approved just last week in Utah that Secretary Salazar took great credit for. We'd been waiting for 4.5 years for that approval. In the administration's previous analysis, they would have concluded that was an idle lease while we're waiting for Uncle Sam to give us permission to produce these resources, to identify the resource on public land. So the bottom line is it's election year politics in our view. It's unfortunate they keep going back to that red herring, But I suspect because of the pressure they're feeling now, because frankly they're inconsistent with where the American people are on the energy equation, that they'll continue to raise these issues. So again, it's very misleading. The industry last year alone invested $200 billion in the United States. So we're hardly sitting on anything. We're anxious to develop it, as Senator Dorgan mentioned earlier, in North Dakota as well.
So for Senator Dorgan, there's a question here. Earlier this morning, the White House's one of the top advisors on energy policy to President Obama, Heather Zeichel, said that the president is focused on increasing domestic oil and gas production, but in places where it makes sense. Do you see the administration opening new opportunities for oil development in a second Obama term?
I believe so. I mean, what happened with the BP spill in the Gulf changed things in the Gulf for a while, and understandably so. I mean, it wouldn't have made much sense to say this doesn't matter. Let's act as if this didn't happen. But I do think in the period ahead, we will see opening of new opportunities in federal lands. I think particularly the Eastern Gulf has significant opportunities. We opened a portion of it, I think in the 2007. I think it was the 2007 bill. We opened a portion. But there's a substantial amount of additional opportunity there and elsewhere. And I think any administration beginning next January is going to take steps to provide additional opportunities on federal lands.
Kevin Book, a question for you. Do you believe speculation is having an effect on prices, oil prices?
I love that question, particularly given that Senator Dorgan asked me that question once, and it was a very sweaty response I gave. Yes, Senator, I do, but it's not the main effect was my answer then. And yes, questioner, I do, but it is not the main effect. Oil travels on the open sea. It takes 4 to 6 weeks to arrive physically in place. When it does, price is correct. Now, speculation can affect some markets that are less liquid and smaller. The U.S. natural gas market has been proven to be one where enforcement actions by the CFTC have been timely, and they have found that manipulation has occurred. The global oil price is set in 3 fundamental places with dozens of derivative places beyond it. It's only about 40% exchange traded, and it tends to reflect fundamentals no matter what you want it to do. So, but to the questioner, I would say, if speculators were manipulating oil prices, why aren't they better at it? Because it seems like they're not very good at their jobs.
Senator Dorgan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes.
Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, I have a career full of statements that I couldn't disavow if I wanted to. I think speculation plays a much more significant role than some do. I mean, I think the commodity index funds have changed the game over recent years. I think from the numbers that I have seen and studied suggest that rather than 30% of those in the market being speculators, it's now about 70%. And you know, you need to make a market. I understand, you know, when we wrote the legislation back in the Congress in the 1930s, we actually put a provision in dealing with excess speculation, because while you need to have a marketplace to establish pricing, you want that marketplace really to be inhabited to the larger extent by people who have oil to sell and those who want to purchase it. And you know, now we have, as I quoted Will Rogers, who used to say in the past, he talked about people who will buy things that they'll never get from people that never had it, and through all that activity make money and establish pricing. But I think this is a very important question, and we need speculators. You need some speculation for liquidity in a marketplace. My own view is that marketplace is rife with excess speculation.
I would say that the senator's made some very thoughtful comments on this in his career, and I'd applaud his thoughtfulness on the issue, because one thing about the Obama administration's proposal, whereas I think it may be premature to write the prescription before you've even diagnosed a disease, so things like new margin requirements, for example, and new position limits may be premature, I do think studying the problem makes sense. There's one particularly obscure area of the overall question that academic researchers really can't get to because the CFTC has most, if not all, of the answers. And more study will deliver more answers. One thing that we know is bad is price volatility is bad. And one way to get rid of price volatility is to give signals to companies like the oil companies that Jack represents that there's going to be demand and there's going to be a market out in the future. So as the price deck deepens, it may not be a risk as long as it doesn't steepen and pitch and fall a lot along the way, because that actually might help to guarantee that we will have supply. But I think the more we learn about it, the more it's going to look less like a smoking gun and more like a few people who may be bad apples in an otherwise very good market and a very good system.
Steve, 2 quick points I just add on it. Markets are driven by expectations. We see a great lesson in this country in the past year on the energy price. Compare crude oil with natural gas, right? A lot of conversation around the world. What are the factors that contribute to the global price of crude oil? Unrest in the Middle East, demand in emerging nations, the list goes on. The one piece we have control over here is adding to that marginal supply equation. So again, we would encourage the policymakers to step forward and say, you know, you're never going to resolve the Middle East equation. You could if we brought more product into the market to relieve that tension. But now contrast that with the price of natural gas. That market too is driven by expectation. And there's a lot of people that would suggest there are other speculators, as they call them, that keep the price of natural gas low. But it's a market that's driven by what the expectation is. We've demonstrated bringing ample supply to the marketplace in the United States has brought that price down to $2.50 versus 13 or 14 of just 2 or 3 years ago. So we need to be thoughtful about the market and be mindful of where government plays an appropriate role and doesn't intervene too much and then unintentionally creates the volatility that nobody wants. We need certainty, long-term vision. Let the markets play out, but contribute in those areas that will have broader supply-demand impact on it.
Joe Stanko, a question for you, although I think it could easily be posed to all of the panelists. Should Congress pass legislation to eliminate all energy subsidies and tax preferences? And then it says, or pass the administration's plans to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and use that revenue for renewable energy and new technologies.
Wow, is that an either-or question?
It's an or.
I think I would agree with folks who have said that energy policy should not pick winners and losers. And what I would like to see Congress do is to just try and remove barriers. I think there is a role for R&D. Unquestionably, there is good research and thoughtful research that could be funded. I think at some point the training wheels have to come off, though, on certain technologies. But I think much more could be accomplished by trying to even out a playing field, and in particularly with regard to the permitting and the future regulation of sources, give industry some certainty that these decisions are going to be made reasonably using appropriate facts, and the implementation of them will be in a way that can enhance private capital investment.
But just to play devil's advocate, I mean, how is the administration supposed to respond to climate change given some of the policy constraints that we've talked about here today? What I mean by that is, you know, they tried to pass cap and trade. That obviously failed because of opposition to it. They have tried to deal with the issue through regulation under the Clean Air Act, the EPA. Many groups, including API, oppose that. They're trying to deal with the issue by giving subsidies to alternative energy. That's become controversial in the case of companies that have failed, like Solyndra. So how then are they supposed to tackle the issue of climate change when all of these options are politically, for one reason or another, not viable?
Well, I think
how do you create that?
They're politically not viable because they haven't been able to convince a working majority in Congress to pass legislation. My own view is that the Clean Air Act is a square peg in a round hole to try and deal with climate issues. One thing, even though the administration's position is, given the Supreme Court ruling and the structure of the Clean Air Act, there are various things that have to happen with regard to greenhouse gases. I do think in the power plant NSPS is an example that you're not using the inherent flexibility that exists in the Act when you're doing things like looking at carbon capture and sequestration and deeming that an established commercial technology. So I think while they may be in a box because of the Supreme Court on climate change, that with regard to implementation in certain judgments, there could be a much better path forward. There are other things with regard
and
to...
what would that look like? What would be the right path? What would be the policies that you think maybe even your clients might support?
Well, I think it's not looking at technologies that are not ready for prime time and declaring them so. And that with regard, again, to issues with greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, they are, again, I think that's a square peg in a round hole. And we're just going to have more problems trying to deal with issues, and one of them that we're going to see, I think, a ruling on from a court is the tailoring rule, where there are actual numeric trigger numbers for permitting in the Clean Air Act, and EPA has said that we're not going to use those. We're going to have a different number for carbon and continue that, far off into the future.
Yeah. Last question for Mr. Connaughton. Considering that this is an election year, is there any potential for any compromise on energy to prevail in Congress, or does the campaign season undermine that?
Well, I'm the Pollyanna. I never say never. The 2007 energy bill was dead a month before it was huge bipartisan support. Just a month later, I've been involved in at least 5 pieces of legislation that were similarly dead in election cycles and not. So I never say never, because things can change. We can hit some big problem this summer, and all of a sudden there's a galvanization, either in advance of the election or in the lame duck. I always believe that we should keep the work of government going, keep the policy ideas going, continue the conversation. This is a very vibrant time, actually, if things are in a lull. This is a very vibrant time to actually have some of the conversations we're having right now to say, well, what does the menu look like, and what's in the art of the possible? Because we also know with a new administration that there's a very productive period of about 18 months when a lot of stuff moves and gets done. And if you don't have the products on the shelves, ready to look at and decide what you're going to put in the shopping cart, then you don't make progress. And so I'm actually, as a policy wonk or geek, whichever word you want to apply, this period between now and January is actually very, very important to the country, even as we pay attention to the broader election themes.
So I want to thank the sponsors of this event, the American Petroleum Institute, as well as our panelists, Joe Stanko, Senator Byron Dorgan, Jim Connaughton, and Kevin Book. Thank you all very much, and thank you all for attending.